Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the CSDD's Business Forum. Today, we're going to have a presentation on how corporate America can be a good steward for voting rights in this very important public time in our country. As many state legislatures are moving to roll back access to the ballot for Americans. We are very grateful to have two wonderful presenters with us today. Allison Riggs, who is going to be speaking with us first. Allison is the co-executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And we also will have Dr. Andra Gillespie, who is the head of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University, joining us shortly to talk about the broader historical context for the current struggle over voting rights in our country. I also want to thank our wonderful sponsors and members in the Business Forum for joining us in this conversation. I want to thank Nike, Meta, PPG, Groupon, Newfront Insurance, 2U for their generous support and for being thought partners with us as we work to find ways that corporations can be important stakeholders in our society and how they try to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion for everyone. So I'm going to ask our first presenter, Allison Riggs, to unmute and talk to us about the important work that she has been doing at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Thank you, Allison, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today and allowing me to speak to such an important group of stakeholders in our democracy right now. As introduced, my name is Allison Riggs, and I'm the co-executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice and chief counsel for voting rights. The Southern Coalition for Social Justice is based out of Durham, North Carolina. We were founded in 2007, and I joined shortly thereafter to be a community lawyering organization in the South, focused on partnering with community-based organizations to advance their own, help them and assist them in advancing their own political, civil, and economic rights. We have a pretty substantial voting rights practice with attorneys, researchers and demographers, communication specialists, and organizers, all bringing to bear their talents to the complex problems facing our democracy right now. And I'm delighted to talk to you a little bit about my organization and why I think our work is important, and also some of the ways, the threats that we're facing, and hopefully ways in which you all can think about engaging with some of these threats. Specifically, I was going to talk about three topics: voter suppression, redistricting, and election subversion, and how each of these, particularly in the South, have a noticeable, demonstrable negative impact on the ability of voters of color to participate in the political process, and what that racial disparity in effect means both for the work that the Southern Coalition does, those voters, and overall how our democracy functions. So first, I think the term voter suppression is one that folks use a lot without perhaps fully understanding how it works. So if you'll bear with me as I make some analogies, hopefully this will help folks understand why some of these laws that might, if you're sitting in your your nice office as a middle class, upper middle class white person like myself, might not seem that huge. But voter suppression efforts are really based on the lingering effects, socioeconomic effects of historical discrimination. And Dr. Gillespie will talk more about that. But part of the reckoning that we still have to face is that the history of discrimination against Black and Brown Americans, and indeed all people of color in this country, have lingering effects. And we see it in access to transportation, we see it in educational attainment, we see it in economic situations, health outcomes. All of these things relate to our history, and we still need to understand that it plays a factor in what I call and what political scientists call the calculus of voting. So just as we know if you put a Starbucks on every corner and make it easier for people to get their coffee, it will remind people to drink their coffee, to stop by. The same thing works with voting too. I mean, it's obviously a fundamental right and much more important than getting a burger or getting a coffee. But we know that the easier that you make it to vote, the more likely people are to do it. And conversely, the harder you make it to vote, the more likely it is to deter people. And the deterrence isn't felt uniformly across all populations. So if you look at voters who are hourly wage workers or with less access to transportation, these are voters for whom closing a polling place or moving a polling place or reducing its hours, that has a real deterrent effect, and it's a lasting one. It doesn't even just have to be for that one election. It's a deterrent effect that can undermine participation. And so, and we know that the socioeconomic disparities that I mentioned are seen along racial and ethnic lines in this country. And so when a legislature passes a voter suppression law, so whether it's eliminating early voting on Sundays or a photo ID law, it may not affect me as a white woman sitting here in North Carolina. It may not affect you. It may not, I have a flexible job that allows me to go and vote whenever I want to, but it does affect voters, and it doesn't have to affect millions of voters to affect election outcomes. But our democracy works best when everyone who's eligible to participate does participate. And why do I say that? Because we have a Republican form of government. We are based on, we have a social contract with our government that we are willing to abide by laws and be governed, and that the government will have the consent of the governed. And so when you have efforts to suppress the vote or push some people out of the political process, even at relatively small numbers, perhaps, sometimes not, sometimes in the thousands, tens of thousands. But when you see that, it really undermines folks' faith in government and makes it harder for those who would be part of the social contract to trust what government does. And so for that very reason, we take very seriously not only any efforts to restrict or make harder access to the ballot box for eligible American voters, but particularly those that fall along racial lines and have disproportionate impacts on voters of color. Voter suppression's got many faces. It's not just voter ID laws or early voting cuts or making it harder to vote absentee, although we've seen all of these in recent years. There's a wide range of ways in which those who are in power may hold on to power by what I would describe as illegitimate means. And so that's what we want to keep an eye on and challenge. And that I think that you all as participants in this program can think about how your groups play a role in ensuring that government works the way it's supposed to. We litigate, obviously, against voter suppression. We helped folks monitor some of these changes that are rammed through on short notice, that are maybe not well publicized or understood, but make access to the ballot box harder. And support community organizations across the South and really across the country, although our focus is the South, to push back against these legislative measures that we believe would distort our democracy. So we just won a voter ID case in North Carolina. We a few years ago won a voter intimidation and defamation case, settled successfully a voter intimidation and defamation case in Virginia, and are constantly fighting against attempts to make absentee voting harder, to cut early voting, to make it easier to reduce the number of polling places. And that's what our work fighting voter suppression looks like. But as I said, voter suppression has many faces, and one of them is we've seen a lot of, and you would have seen a lot of in the news recently, relating to redistricting, which is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is another one of those words that's very popular lately. But one, I want to make sure everyone understands how it works, and two, understands that even when sort of done for admitted or naked political advantage, still has racial effects and implications. For as long as we've been redrawing the lines that we use to elect members of Congress, members of the state legislature, members of our county commissions and city councils, for as long as we've been doing that, the process of doing that has been one that has been used to undermine and silence the voices of voters of color. And that's another one of those hard realities that we need to grapple with. There's many different ways of doing it. You can crack communities of interest and communities of color. You can pack them. You can racially gerrymander. You can fail to create new districts that would provide opportunities for growing populations of voters of color. But regardless, however you do it, it still distorts our democracy. It allows those in power to pick who's going to be in their district, who's going to be their voters, rather than the voters picking who will represent them and their interests in that decision-making body. And this affects all aspects of our daily lives, whether you're talking about a member of Congress or a city council person, you're talking about local zoning decisions, affordable housing, over policing, all the way up to the kinds of ways in which our tax dollars are being used, and the buy-in that voters should have into that kind of decision making is lost and distorted when these kinds of manipulative line drawing efforts are in play. One thing I think that's important to recognize, and may not be applicable for everyone depending on where you live, but the Southern strategy is one that is still in effect here in the South and has been very effective and powerful, which was an effort to make one party the party of people of color and the other party the party of white voters. And obviously that, it's a broad generalization, and it doesn't always hold true, but it largely holds true. And we see patterns of voting being very predictable along racial lines. And what that allows people to do is say, well, for example, I'm just drawing these congressional districts to benefit Republican voters. I'm not trying to harm Black and Latinx voters in Florida, I'm just trying to secure seats for people who support my my political party. And so it allows line drawers to disclaim racial discrimination and cloak themselves in partisan intent, but is in truth very much has a real racially discriminatory impact because of that Southern strategy. And we litigate redistricting cases all across the South. We have, since our inception, from Virginia down to Texas. We are currently litigating in Texas, looking at other states, including Florida and Tennessee. And we just wrapped up a North Carolina redistricting case where we were able to convince the North Carolina Supreme Court that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional under the North Carolina Constitution. And the Republican leadership in our state appealed that decision, which was based just on the state constitution, appealed it to the US Supreme Court under a theory that only state legislatures, not courts, are in charge of federal elections, whether it's how you conduct them or the districts used to elect members of Congress. And on Monday, we succeeded in convincing the Supreme Court not to intervene at this stage and to allow the remedy redistricting plan, a fair redistricting plan for North Carolina's congressional districts, to be in place for 2022. But the court did signal an interest in discussing this issue. It's called the independent state legislatures theory next term. And so we may end up there ultimately again in front of the US Supreme Court. And the reason that I mention this is it's a little bit of a wonky thing, but it gets into the next topic that I want to talk about, which is election subversion. So you might say, oh, well, redistricting doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with everything that happened after the 2020 election and what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol. But it actually does. And I want to make sure that your organizations understand the threat that it creates not only to the normal and effective functioning of government, but also just to the stability of our democracy and our functioning economy. If it is true that state legislatures can mess with congressional elections or can mess with federal elections, which would affect the US Senate, that they can decide whether or not elections were conducted legitimately or not, it essentially means that folks who are not unbiased, who have a political interest in an outcome, can disregard the will of voters. And we see it happening a lot, particularly in states where the population has changed and the voters' preferences have changed. So we saw a lot of interest in states like Arizona and Georgia, where voters of color, the populations of voters of color are increasing dramatically. But two, those voters said, we want different representation. We want to be heard differently in federal elections. And the reaction was, well, we the legislature get the ultimate say, not the voters, because if the courts can't be a co-equal branch of government and stop an overreaching state legislature, then nothing is left. And so many corporations spoke out against not only voter suppression, but the legislative groundwork for election subversion in states like Texas and Georgia. That was critically important. And if the courts decide, if the US Supreme Court as it's currently constituted, decides that this independent state legislature's theory has feet, we're going to be deprived very significantly of our ability to fight back against election subversion. And your corporate citizenship and involvement maybe become even more critical to ensuring that our democracy stays functioning and that voters believe in the government and the decisions that it makes. I think that we see this, and particularly when we know that a lot of this voter suppression, gerrymandering, and election subversion is linked to states and places where voters of color are making themselves heard. And so again, I appreciate your time here. Understand that this is a fight not just for any one election result, but to ensure that we live up to our best ideals as a country, that we include everyone, and that we are wary of tactics and strategies that lead us down a road of authoritarianism rather than an actual functioning democracy. Our website is www.scsj.org. You can reach me at Allison, Allison, at scsj.org. Twitter is at SCSJ. And I'd encourage you all to learn more about our organization and the things that we're doing to fight back and to make sure that voters are heard no matter what. Thank you.
Allison, that was so powerful. Thank you. That was the best explainer on voting rights that I've heard ever. And so you better be careful. I'm going to have you come to my American government classes every year and do that more for us. So I know that Andra, who's joining us from a family engagement, is coming on now. So we'll shift over and introduce her in a minute. But Allison, before you go off, I did want to just use the moderator's preference to ask you one thing. Like, so, you know, you made some really big connections to this central theme about how this matters for racial equity, right? And your explainer was really great in setting the stage there. One thing that I don't think a lot of people understand is how connected the current wave of suppression laws is to the success of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And so we saw so many corporations making pledges and supporting the Black Lives Matter activities and based on the demands of their workers. Could you just say a bit about how you see these two things, that corporations and particularly DEI functions leading the charge, you know, as stakeholders to support, racial justice in these arenas? How is that connected to what we're seeing now, what you and your colleagues are doing every day to preserve the right to vote? What are the ways that that's tied together? Can you just say a word about that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about the ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial justice movement at large have focused in on specific areas that are of our civil justice system, of our criminal justice system, that are just irrevocably broken at this moment. Understanding the ways in which policy and democracy are related is absolutely critical. So making sure that police brutality, over-policing is addressed, and making sure that courts hold accountable those who would gun down innocent men, Black men running on the street. All of those policy issues and the ways we organize around them can be impeded if our democratic system doesn't work too, to make sure that judges who are elected fairly, to make sure that city councils who appoint police chiefs and who oversee the functioning of police departments I think part of the attack on democracy, sort of in a backlash movement in response to the support for Black Lives Matter and racial justice, is understanding that where corporate America is supporting DEI efforts, voters of color in this country, it created a tipping point that unless the democratic participation is interrupted more, that these efforts that the folks watching this are making, they're scared. Those who don't want to change are scared. And so impeding political participation is a way to disrupt the good things that corporate America has been doing to help create the systemic change and dismantle systems of oppression. And so we can't stop at just funding the policy issues. You shouldn't stop funding on those policy and organizing issues, but you should understand and support efforts to create a functioning democracy underneath, or to prevent attacks on that, because that's how we will create lasting change, in line with the work that the organizations listening have been doing so well over the past few years.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for putting a fine point on that for us, Allison. So now we're going to introduce, we're fortunate to have Dr. Andra Gillespie, the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. She's going to unmute and join us and talk a bit about how the current voter suppression efforts and the fight to preserve ballot access for communities of color in particular, that people like Allison and even she is engaged in places like Georgia, how that fits in with this big picture of who we're trying to be as a multiracial democracy. This fight, Dr. Gillespie, as you know, did not start in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter uprisings. And so could you give us a little bit of context about, why are corporations so far ahead of, say, our political class and understanding that everybody should have, racial equity? Like, what's at stake for some politicians that are trying to turn the clock back? And how do we work to preserve what we've gained since the end of the civil rights movement? So I'm going to leave you with those light questions and mute myself so that you can talk a bit about these issues for us.
Sure. Thank you very much, Al, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Before I make my comments, I should disclose that I am a board member of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, so I'm good friends with Allison. The other thing that I should disclose is that I'm going to give you a case study of data from Georgia because it's recent and I had direct access to it. My comments that I'm making are things that we should be asking nationally, should be speaking about nationally, and I'll talk about sort of where there might be applications for future data collection and research, but I'm specifically talking about things that are happening sort of just before SB 202, and I'm not going to make any presumptions about my data being able to speak to that, and I won't be able to answer questions about that. So I do want to look at sort of what the last election cycle can teach us about the current election cycle we're in, and even looking ahead towards 2024. And I want to frame this in terms of thinking about what elections look like in a very competitive environment. And part of the reason why we are in the moment that we're in is because this is a very, very competitive environment. So people were very surprised in 2020 to see Georgia vote Democratic in a presidential election, and then a month later to elect 2 Democratic senators to the US Senate, evenly dividing the chamber. But it's important for us to put this into context. We can also look at other ways and in other places where we've seen the same type of increased competitiveness. So if we look at presidential elections in Georgia, I think people were very much used to thinking about Georgia politics as being decidedly Republican and ruby red in its orientation. The truth is that Georgia had within the previous decade become increasingly competitive electorally. So So where George W. Bush is winning the state by very, very comfortable margins, those margins had started to narrow during the candidacies of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And that brings us to the point where they're at rough parity with each other and slightly ahead in 2020. The same thing is actually also true in gubernatorial elections. So Stacey Abrams moves the needle tremendously, but she was actually following in the wake of Roy Barnes and Jason Carter, who had run elections that were 10 points or about 6 points sort of behind their competitors. So we don't see these double-digit blowout margins that we once saw. The state had become increasingly more competitive. And that this is actually also true in Senate elections as well. If we look at where there were runoffs and when there were elections, we can see that the same thing is happening there as well. So if we look at some of the changes in Georgia that happened in the 70s and 80s, that was due to a secular realignment of white voters away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The shift that we're seeing happening today, and I don't want to give a demographics is destiny kind of sort of explanation of this as though that's the only thing that's going on here, but demographics actually do matter a whole lot. But there's also increased organization and there are other factors that are at play here. And so one of the things that we can see is that Georgia's electorate is diverse. So in the fall of 2020, while more than half of the voters in the state were white, nearly a third were Black, and we saw an increasing and growing proportion of voters who identified as Hispanic or Asian American. If we look at this over time, one of the things that you can see is that there's been this sort of shrinking of the white electorate in the state, and then there's been a growth in non-white electorates. In particular, we see the number of Asian American and Hispanic voters double over the course of nearly a decade in the state of Georgia. With these groups, along with African Americans being more likely to vote Democratic than Republican, it's given Democrats opportunities to be able to be more competitive in statewide elections. And by competitive, I mean, you know, at least coming within 5 to 10 points of being able to win. So the data was from the Senate runoff, so this is what I'm going to talk about here. The reason why Democrats win is because they had better turnout operation. And so for reasons that I'm going to explain in a second, Democrats were doing more to touch voters, at least based on the survey data that I have. And the efforts to target minority voters were stepped up and should be sustained in future election cycles, if only on principle. So you don't have to come from this from a partisan perspective. You just have to come from this, from the idea of everybody should have the right to vote and should be able to exercise their franchise. And so one of the takeaway lessons of 2020 was that if you talk to minority voters and remind them to turn out to vote, they vote. All right, so in 2008, the last time there were Senate runoffs, there were more Republican voters than there were Democrats in the state. And so while the margin in the Senate general election was actually pretty narrow because Barack Obama was on the ballot and there was a coattail effect, by the time we get to the runoff election, the voter turnout effort was anemic amongst the Democrats, and it returned back to an equilibrium, which would have suggested that the Republican would win pretty handily. That's actually not the same dynamic in 2020 that we see happening there. And then it is compounded by strategic decisions that Republicans and Democrats made. So Republicans canvassed throughout the election cycle. They weren't conscious of COVID. And so that sort of yielded a high risk, high reward proposition that if Democrats weren't going to canvass, but Republicans were going to canvass, there was a chance Republican voters were going to turn out at higher rates because you would have touched more people and increased their probability of voting. On the other hand, after sort of having that very, very narrow election win in November, what we see is that Democrats, by the time we get to the runoff cycle, are less COVID conscious, and they're willing to take the risk in order to make sure that Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock win. So they resume canvassing in the runoff period, despite the continued challenge of COVID-19, in order to try to maximize voter turnout. And they may have been helped by Donald Trump's, clause that the election was rigged and telling Republican voters that they shouldn't turn out to vote. So given this, right, Republicans needed to mobilize low propensity voters. And the challenge is that their standard bearer is telling those low propensity voters that they shouldn't turn out to vote. On the other hand, Democrats were used to low propensity voters perhaps voting in November, but not voting in a runoff election. They needed to get those voters out to vote. They also had to face the fact that proportionally speaking, Black voters actually made up a smaller share of Georgia's electorate in 2020 in the November election than their registration numbers would have suggested. So they really needed to boost Black turnout there. So to look at this a little bit more, I ran a survey through Qualtrics through an internet sample. And so this is unweighted. Once I sort of finish cleaning the data, I'm going to have to wait to make sure that we've got sort of a good distribution of voters in the election. But I have respondents here. Some of these voters I'm going to leave out for list-wise deletion, but like I have about 600 voters. The sample is likely going to be closer to 500. I was collecting this on the day of the election and going into the day after the election. So I pulled this out of the field just as I'm starting to see the Capitol breach happen on January 6th. One of the things that I found in my respondents was that proportionally speaking, Black voters were more likely to report that they had had contact with a campaign, particularly in the direct types of personal contact that we know empirically are more likely to increase voter turnout. So if you look at this table, I asked voters for this in this January survey, what kind of contact they got for the November election and what kind of contact they got for the Senate runoff election. And so what you can see here is that compared to the full sample and compared to their Republican counterparts, Blacks are reporting more direct contacts with people. So that suggests that the efforts of people like Nsé Ufot were certainly yielding the results that they would have wanted. And this may actually help to explain some of the lackluster turnout that we saw amongst Republicans. So Donald Trump aside, if Democrats are actually hitting the pavement and doing more direct contact in a state where there are close to equal numbers of Democratic and Republican voters, right? That could be the difference between winning and losing an election. Now, the survey does ask voters how confident they were that their vote would be counted fairly. Overall, 3/4 of voters said that they believed that their vote would be counted fairly. Blacks were particularly sanguine that their vote was going to be counted fairly in the runoff election. Where we see the drop-off is amongst Republican voters, where only slightly more than half of respondents said that they would thought that their vote would be counted fairly. And when we probe a little bit further, we give them a list of reasons as to why their vote might not count fairly. What we see is that the responses again vary by race and vary by party. So overall, what we see is that Republicans were the ones who were expressing a likelihood of voting security. So the numbers down at the bottom will tell you the number of people who expressed some anxiety about voting based on the sort of total number of people who could have been part of that subsample. And so about 1/3 of Blacks had expressed some concern about voting, while upwards of 70% of Republicans expressed some concern about voting. Overall, sort of if we look at the number of people who compared concerns about voting, sort of in the full sample, that number is kind of approaching about 60%. So if we look at what people were concerned about, there were a lot of people who were concerned about computer hacking. That was more pronounced amongst Republicans than it was amongst Blacks, or the full sample. If we look at African Americans are more likely to express concerns about sort of classic forms of voter suppression and intimidation. So Blacks were more likely than others to worry about election officials stopping them from being able to exercise the right to vote. Blacks were more concerned about voter intimidation. Those numbers are much, much smaller if we compare them to Republicans and if we compare them to the full sample. The other thing that African Americans were more likely to be concerned about was whether or not they were being told that they weren't registered to vote when they firmly believed that they were. Then we asked people, like, did you have problems in the election? And if so, can you tell me what did you have this particular type of problem? So the column actually lists the types of problems that people thought that they had. And so what we see is that one, overall, people didn't report having very many problems with the election cycle, and that it's actually African Americans who are slightly more likely, though this isn't statistically significant, to report having problems than even Republicans who would express all kinds of anxieties or concerns about the election cycle. Then the survey does include some questions about what types of remedies do you think we should use in order to, make improve voting access or to make voting more fair. And here, party identification seems to be the driver of what's going on. So again, I compare Blacks, Republicans to the overall sample. And so what we see are the numbers that are marked in green are the places where Republicans are more likely to support measures. And so those tend to be more punitive measures. voters for ballot security, as they may frame it. So requiring IDs to be included with absentee ballots, eliminating no excuses absentee voting, requiring signature matches on absentee ballots, which is a huge issue in Georgia, right? And then if we look at efforts that might actually expand the franchise, make it easier, Republicans tend to be less likely to support that. So they're less likely to support re-enfranchising the formerly incarcerated. They're less supportive of election day registration. They're less supportive of allowing out of precinct voting. They're more, the one interesting one is that they are less supportive of ending registration purges, which is sort of, again, sort of falling into that punitive category. There was one place where I do a split sample where I ask people, like, there should be more voting machines in precincts, right, to sort of expedite the process. And that split between saying that you should have more voting machines in minority precincts. And what we see overall is that there's less support for more voting machines when it's framed as something that's targeting minority communities. That number probably is not going to hold up statistically. But then if we look at the differences amongst Republicans, it's a 11-point difference in terms of should you have more voting machines. So yes, people are more supportive of it, but they're less supportive of it when it's framed in terms of actually helping minority precincts, where if we look at national data, Blacks are more likely to report standing longer in line in order to be able to cast their ballot. So the takeaways from this are that Republicans lost for tactical reasons. Democrats were more likely to mobilize people who were likely to be Democratic voters. And then while there are anxieties about voting, they don't actually report problems, particularly in the group that is complaining the most about this. And we can't ignore partisanship in this discussion. So I'd like to end with thinking about, and I don't know if Allison got to this because I got on the call late, but thinking about voter suppression and intent versus disparate impact. So I know legally she's probably gone over some of this, right? Sometimes you enact policies that are intended to increase or decrease turnout. If you intended to decrease turnout among some groups and they don't succeed, that I still say that that is voter suppression. And then we also need to, from a legal standpoint, think about the disparate impact. So you do a facially neutral policy, but it ends up disproportionately affecting protected classes like racial and ethnic minorities or language minorities over others. That's also suppression. So when I end, I usually come up with a nice 2x2 table about whether or not you intended to suppress, then versus whether or not you actually did end up suppressing minority turnout. And if you intended and it worked, it's definitely suppression. If you intended, but it didn't have an impact, it's still suppression, because that's what you meant to do. But if you didn't tend to suppress, but it still has a disparate impact, it's still a problem. So the only time that it's not really voter suppression in my book is when you didn't intend to oppress and to suppress, and it didn't actually have a negative impact. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your comments.
That was great, Andra. Thank you so much for sharing your takeaways from Georgia. Just following with what we did with Allison, I just wanted to ask you, so the thing that really struck me the most is that you with Allison framed the diversification of the state and the country as one of the main drivers of these new moves to suppress, right? And so if you're the leader of a DEI function in a corporation, or the leader of a business, how do you think through this partisan piece, right? Because you've kind of got an obligation to make your workplace friendly for everyone, somewhat neutral in terms of partisanship. But here we have a very clear example of partisan motivated behavior that is likely going to be targeting the majority of the worker base in a diversifying country, right? So like, how should a business leader or a DEI leader wrap their mind around balancing this kind of commitment to let everyone have their, say, partisan affinities, but also, as the title of the panel says, being a good steward for voting rights in the age of suppression, right? So any thoughts on that you might share with our stakeholders?
So I think at framing is really important here. In all of the discussion about the big lie and the 2020 election, right, we forgot that Donald Trump actually just made very bad strategic decisions, and people who should have known better and should have challenged him on those decisions, like, went along with stupid ideas that empirically are unsound, things that political scientists and practitioners could have told you are not going to work, right? So whatever problems President Trump has with his party and not listening to advisors who know more about this stuff, I don't think we can do anything about. But I think business leaders are in a position to promote policies that are going to be good for everybody. So the idea that canvassing increases voter turnout is not partisan. Empirically, we have studied this in communities of every hue. It has been studied in partisan contexts, both in Democratic and Republican contexts and in nonpartisan contexts. It doesn't matter who you are. If I knock on your door and tell you you're going to vote, I'm going to increase your likelihood of turning out to vote higher than I would if I sent you a robotic sort of, pre-recorded phone message. So I think that there are ways to support both liberal and conservative, Democratic and Republican efforts to drive up voter turnout. And you can help shift the conversation towards those common sense things that work for anybody, regardless of what their affiliation is. I think also another way that DEI groups might want to do that, depending on what your government affairs spending is. It's not unusual for corporations to try to give money to Democrats and Republicans, right? Because you want to be in good with whoever is in power, right? But you can make decisions about whom you're going to give your money to based on how they've been behaving for the last year and a half. Right. So not every Republican has endorsed the big lie. Not every Republican has, been supportive of suppressive legislation. So if you're only giving to the people who support sort of voting access, both Democratic and Republican, that sends a really important signal about what your priorities are. And then there are the things that I think people can do within their organizations that are going to help everybody vote. So whether that is setting up voter registration drives, in the office, if you're back in the office, or giving everybody the day off so that they could go vote or help other people vote, that's something that should be considered party neutral.
Wow, those are some really great concrete suggestions. Okay, I think we should move to a broader Q&A phase. I'm going to ask Allison to unmute. We're also fortunate that Nsé Ufot, through some Herculean effort, was able to overcome her delayed flight and join us for the Q&A portion. So welcome, Nsé. Thank you for making the time to join this part of the conversation with us. Again, most of our stakeholders are going to be watching this in terms of on demand or remote. And so I'm going to just open up with one final question from me, and then we'll see if we do have anyone on the webinar who wants to ask a direct question. But the first thing that I want to ask, starting with Nsé, is, we've just heard from Andra what she thinks are some good ideas that corporate leaders can engage in to make things better in this fight. What are two things that corporate leaders can do to help each of you in your work? So starting with Nsé, it'd be great to hear from you on this.
Well, one, I will say that Dr. Gillespie hit the greatest hits. And so I really appreciate that. And I'd just like to plus one her contributions. I would also say that, I think that we are very much in an age of misinformation and disinformation, that it has poisoned in many ways the wells in which people are getting information about elections, our democracy, and the world around us. And to the extent that corporate communications exist in particular organizations, I think that being, that there's a civic responsibility that exists to talk plainly and clearly about election opportunities, about things that could be framed as attacks on our democracy, and sort of explaining the world around us, but also explaining their government relations decisions, their investment decisions. Those things don't often happen in the light of day. Like, it often is like a person who has a particular interest that will investigate and ask about the strategy. And so I think bringing some of those government relation decisions to the light of day, particularly those that have some distance from the core business function. And so if you are making sort of a general investment in a Republican leadership caucus, articulating to the employee base and to your base of stakeholders why and why leadership decided to make that decision, I think that that's super important.
That's great. Allison, what about you? You're in the trenches. You're in these courtrooms every week, helping to preserve ballot access. What are two things that our stakeholders or other corporations could do to help you?
So one, I think might come off as trite as expected, but we can use your financial support. That's just the bottom line is economic uncertainty and how the challenges that just keep coming down the pipeline for us. Having a diversified economic support is incredibly important to the groups that are supporting systemic change driven at a grassroots level. The other one is engage in partnership with us. We don't want to be tokenized and sort of don't want our partnership with us to be held out as some sort of like defense, but we have engaged, my organization has engaged with partnerships with a number of corporations, Red Hat here in North Carolina, who've helped us with research, technology. Those kinds of partnerships do a couple of things. They, again, build a sense within the corporate culture of what partnering with organizations like ours does. Makes the workers there believe that there is a commitment to DEI within the organization, but it allows us to support well-intentioned and good faith efforts to have corporate good citizenship seen and believed in. So those are my two requests, and always welcome at SCSJ.
So we do have a question from one of our panelists. Oh, go ahead, Nsé.
Alvin, if I may beg your pardon and add one more contribution, and that is like one of the things that I am deeply concerned about, and it is a core sort of priority in our work moving forward, is the idea that, there are 19 states where Republicans have given themselves all the tools that they need to overturn the results of elections that they do not like. And I use Republicans as a descriptor because the New Georgia Project is a nonpartisan organization, and fiercely so. But we're deeply concerned about what that means for the midterm elections and whether or not we will find ourselves in a constitutional crisis where we haven't seated a Congress, and that is very real. And so as I mentioned about internal communications, and to the extent that, corporate leadership has an opportunity to communicate to employees, I think that to the extent that they communicate to the customer base and to the world, I think that democracy needs some champions in this moment, and it does not hurt to sort of amplify the messages and the work that's happening out on the ground and out in these states, because this is not, the British are definitely coming. The threat is absolutely inside of the House, and Georgia and 18 other states. I mean, we talk about the fact that over 400 anti-voting bills have been introduced in 49 state legislatures in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. And so while they were introduced in 49 states, they have passed in 19, and even if only 9 or 5 refuse to seat the people who are legitimately elected, we could definitely find ourselves in a crisis. And to the extent that we can stave that off by a robust sort of campaign and robust communications around their commitment to the rule of law, their commitment to democracy, the recognition that living in a free democratic society is the context in which you can make wild profits, I think is really, really important in this moment.
So this was great. That's perfect. And say the question from the chat is essentially touches on that. It asked, do any of the panelists have recommendations on what we should be doing inside our businesses to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to this fight? Sounds like what you're saying is communicating your values in support of democracy and voting rights is one of the many ways that you can do that. The question also asks for benchmarks and internal metrics. Andra, I think going back to the things that you were recommending, I mean, you talked explicitly about, giving days off on election day, right? My own work, I've thought a lot about in terms of metrics. I mean, if you're not, there's a lot of corporations now that are doing a lot of collection on metrics about, end user experiences of their workers, what neighborhoods they live in, how long it takes them to get to work. I mean, I've done a lot of that assessment work, asking them, about their voting experience and how that connects up with the inequalities that Allison told us about in the first third of the program. These are really key ways to identify, the ways that corporations, the voting rights fight can have a positive externality on diversity, equity, and inclusion in-house, in the businesses, in the shops, right? And so, anybody want to add to that? That's probably going to be the last bit we'll be able to say. But I thought, Andra, you gave some really, kitchen table how-to advice for corporations that was really, I wanted to spotlight.
Thank you. One of the things that I think I like about your metrics is that if we encourage corporations to collect this data on voter experience for their organizations, that actually puts them in a position to be able to give expert testimony in their state legislatures about what's happening to people within their organizations. It's also something that professors, if we ever got a hold of it, would use. I mean, there's some limitations on generalizability, but you represent big constituencies and you wield a lot of power and influence. And if you know what your employees' experiences are, especially if they vary by race, I think that that's actually something that's really powerful, and it comes from an unexpected place. People expect folks like me to say stuff all the time about how it's harder for people of color to vote, right? They're not expecting some corporate titan to be like, look, we talk to everybody in our organization and we know. And then you compare it with the academic data that people like Al and I collect to say that like this is for real. And so that might actually do a lot more to evangelize people to the idea that this is serious and that everybody needs to take it seriously.
Yeah. Okay, we'll give Allison a last response and we'll close with Nsé.
I really would just turn it over to Nsé, since we have not gotten to hear a lot of her brilliance.
Okay, go ahead and say last word to you.
Well, I would say that one of the things that really pushed through, again, with the disinformation and the misinformation, but also just the incredible amount of noise, right, around elections has been creativity, right? We were super grateful for when the Hawks decided we are quarantining, we are not using our facilities. And so why not turn them into election locations so that we can provide some relief to the counties when we're thinking about, making shorter lines. I think about corporate restaurant groups that deployed food trucks and bottles of water. I mean, they were branded, so I'm certain that it was a branding exercise for the business itself, right? But providing relief and comfort to voters who were exercising their civic duty and participating. I think that when you're thinking about creating and maintaining a culture, a civic culture, a civically engaged culture internally to the organization, deploying the things that your business is actually good at or known for with a slice of creativity, I think is good for the internal culture, but also how you show up amongst your customers and stakeholders and in the public.
That's a great exclamation point for this session. I just want to thank Allison, Andra, and Nsé for their brilliance, for their activism, for standing with their fingers in the breach. And I hope that everyone has learned as much from them today as I have. Thank you all, ladies, so much. Thank you.